Well, this has been quite a week for me because all of a sudden people start reaching out to me to ask questions about MMT. Even from people who don't even know I wrote a book on MMT, they're like, "Oh, you're interested in economics. What is this MMT thing?" And I'm like, what's going on? Right? And what happened in the UK, which is where I live, is that a politician started saying a few things that sounded a lot like MMT, right? Which is modern monetary theory, or this heterodox economic theory. This is the leader of the Green Party in the UK, Zach Polanski, who's saying in interviews that, well, government debt is not really a problem. The debt we owe to the central bank, it's kind of debt we owe to ourselves. So it's not real debt, right? Lots of things that sound a lot like he's been inspired by MMT. He hasn't used those words, but then people started saying he's definitely learned about MMT, and now it's part of the conversation in the UK, which is a bit odd because I think in the US people are more aware of MMT. But in the UK, it's kind of like, it's a fringe theory. Nobody takes it seriously. But now I think it's part of the conversation. And I find it pretty fascinating.
You just wrote a book recently. I don't think it's quite available for purchase for the general public, but it's called "If You Can Just Print Money, Why Do I Pay Taxes? Modern Monetary Theory Distilled and Debunked in Plain English." So what exactly is MMT? And you're saying in the UK this is going around for the first time. I mean, Bernie Sanders and AOC were talking about this years ago. I mean, I even saw an interview with Milton Friedman talking about MMT when he was still alive, and I think Milton Friedman passed away like 20 years ago now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an old theory. Like, it's been around, I would say, for 25, 30 years now. Yeah. But yeah, I can tell you what it is. It's an economic theory, pretty holistic. It covers lots of things, from how money works to unemployment. Why does unemployment happen? How can we fix it? So it's a mix of economic understanding, but also recommended policies, I would say. And the idea is as follows. The government could create money. We think of the treasury could create money to pay for its spending or pay off its debt, for whatever it wants to do. It could create money, and this could be used as a force for good, to do good stuff. Otherwise, it's useless, right? So the government could create money out of the blue, and it could solve unemployment. It could save the planet. There are lots of things the government could do with this without causing inflation. So that's the caveat, right? Because people would react to this immediately, and they would say, okay, this is what Argentina has tried, or Venezuela, does, and it doesn't work because you end up having inflation. But these people tell you, no, we've actually found a way to exploit or to utilize this power to create money in a way that's not going to cause inflation. This sounds like a free lunch, right? Which is like, my God, this is such a great low-hanging opportunity without any adverse consequences, right? And it is like, what they try to tell you is this is a free lunch, right? And in their own words. So you have MMTers using the words free lunch to describe this. It is very seductive, I would say. Like, who doesn't want a free lunch and a new way of doing policy making and solving pressing issues, right? And that's MMT in a nutshell.
To really get it into this conversation, you probably have to start with just how is money even created? Because I think even a lot of people don't even have a full grasp of that.
Yeah. So there are two levels of money right now in the economy. We need to understand that. One level is the one we are used to, which is the money in our bank accounts. Let's say you have an account at HSBC and there's a balance in that account. Money moves from account to account when you pay someone. This money is created when commercial banks extend loans to people. So literally, if you go to the bank and say, I want a mortgage, and the bank gives you the mortgage, they invent the money out of thin air and put it in your account, right? This is what people would call broad money, potentially, the money that people or the general public can access, right? But there's another level of money, let's say now I have an account at HSBC. You have an account at another bank. Let's call it Barclays. That's a bank here in the UK. I don't know if you have Barclays in the US. I think not. But anyway, you have an account at Barclays. So I applied for mortgage. I got my mortgage. The money was invented, right? So now the sum pops up in my bank account where I can see that I can actually use this money to buy a house and to actually hire maybe a contractor to do some work that happens to be you. You have your account at Barclays. And now I need to send you this money to make a payment. And this broad money will move from my account to your account, but the banks behind the scenes have a different kind of money called reserves that they use to settle these payments, right? My bank was okay with inventing money out of the blue when I applied for the mortgage, but your bank will not be okay with doing that. If I say, hey, I need to transfer you some money. So what happens behind the scenes is that they settle this transaction usually at the end of the day by using this other level of money called reserves that can be accessed by the public, and commercial banks cannot create it, right? Yeah, they can extend loans and create the money, but they need to have enough reserves to be able to kind of settle the transaction at the end of the day. This money, the reserves, is created by the central bank, right? So you have the central bank creating reserves, then the commercial banks creating the broad money that we use, right? So two levels of money in the current system. The treasury, when it spends, think of the US Treasury or the UK Treasury. So the branch of the government that does public works, that collects, taxes and stuff, they don't really create money. MMTers, people who support MMT, they will tell you that they create money. In reality, that's not quite how it works. The government has bank accounts, both in commercial banks and also at the central bank. And money is moved around when the treasury collects taxes and when it spends, right? The government has bank accounts that can go negative, right? So they need to top up those accounts before they spend, right? So the treasury is not really involved in money creation in the US or in the UK, in most places actually. So it's the central bank and the commercial banks that create these two levels of money.
Your book's called, If You Can Just Print Money, Why Do I Pay Taxes? I guess the question is is the government just printing money? I mean, I think everyone knows that in 1971, at least in the US, the gold standard ended. And especially in this digital age where you're just moving money, numbers run on a computer screen. It's not even and there's even whole countries, whole societies that are cashless. So it's not even there's plenty of countries that aren't even actually physically printing currency. So I guess the question is if it just even, simplified even further, essentially is money just created on a computer screen in 2025, 2026?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, there's obviously still coins going around. Not here in the UK. People don't use cash for most things anymore. But yeah, so most money nowadays is created by altering a number in a computer. You can think of an Excel spreadsheet that says Jesse has this much money in his account. Emmanuel has this much money in his account. I apply for a mortgage and the bank literally replaces that number with a higher number. And the money is created out of thin air. And this money is not backed by any physical asset or commodity like in the past. For example, gold. I can't go and say, I have this much money in my account. Now give me the equivalent of that in gold or silver. So no longer the case. So it's all numbers in computers.
In preparation for this, I was watching a lot of I was watching a lot of videos on MMT and how money was created. But basically, from a lot of people, and I think even Steve Keen, who you talk a lot about in your book, he basically says that MMT is just a description of how the actual system works. And if you don't, and just money is essentially just accounting. He says a lot of economists don't actually understand how the economy works because they're not accountants. And people, I think some people probably think that Steve Keen's an MMTer, but he's not. He does agree with the money creation aspect of it, but there's a lot of areas where he disagrees. I think the job guarantee program and a lot of things like that, and also this, I think he basically says MMTers oversimplify it.
Yeah, I think so. There are two things I want to say about that. So MMTers, yeah, they speak a lot about accounting and how money is accounting and stuff. But they have made mistakes in their understanding of this accounting, right? They try to rectify this, sometimes in a desperate way, but they criticize others for not understanding the accounting. And they're right, sometimes. People don't fully understand how money works. But they've made pretty bad mistakes. And I'm going to tell you one example now. But they don't acknowledge they've made a mistake. So now what happens is that, yeah, they say this is all accounting, but they're trying to, to formulate or to popularize the wrong accounting, very disingenuous accounting. A mistake they made was to ignore that the government has a bank account at the central bank that is deducted every time the treasury spends, right? And at one point, that account can go negative, can go to zero, and then the government can't spend anymore, right? This means that you need taxes prior to spending, logically, because if you do not top up the account, the treasury can keep spending, right? But MMTers, and I think this started in maybe 1998 when Stephanie Kelton published a paper that said the government does not need taxes in order to spend. It actually couldn't even possibly use that money because the tax money is deleted from the record. Again, we think of the accounting, it's deleted from the record, but it's not. That was a mistake that Kelton made. The reason for the mistake is that statisticians, when they calculate how much money exists in the economy, they often use a metric, let's call it, called M1, which only counts money in private bank accounts. So government money is excluded by definition. And so Stephanie Kelton, she reads this and she thinks that, oh, look, when the government spends, M1 goes up, which means money is created. But this ignores that actually money moved from a public account to a private account. The total amount is the same, right? And they got very confused by this, and they started claiming the government doesn't even need taxes in order to spend. Because look, when you collect a tax, the money disappears because M1 goes down. She ignored actually the bank account, owned by the government actually goes up. This is an accounting error that they made. And a few years later, they tried to kind of divert the conversation somewhere else. And I'm going to tell you something that Steve Keen does that is very, very much like MMTers do. He has a book that I read. I actually enjoyed it a lot. I think it's called New Economics. And in his book, he discusses MMT and he says, MMTers say that the government doesn't really need taxes prior to spending. He kind of agrees with them. And he develops the argument using balance sheets. So, but then at one point he says, well, actually, yes, it is true that there's a government account that if it goes to zero, it can't keep spending. So it basically starts by saying MMT is right, then showing you why it's wrong. But then he says, well, this doesn't matter because look, during COVID, the Bank of England let the UK government have an overdraft. So go negative, right? So MMT is still correct. You don't need taxes. It's kind of what he says. And this is something MMTers do a lot. No, that was a mistake that you made. You can't just say the government doesn't need taxes. But then they go and they tell you this kind of exception. The Bank of England was very explicit about this. The overdraft was only allowed temporarily because of the situation. This is not the normal state of affairs. The Treasury would agree to, have a solid plan to top up that overdraft account. But yeah, so what MMTers do is like sometimes they get the accounting right, maybe in some ways, but then it kind of goes south very quickly. So all of this is to tell you that the idea that MMT is just good accounting is not quite right. It's actually sometimes pretty bad accounting, and then they try to kind of use some exception somewhere to cover the mistake that they've made, right? So that was the first thing I wanted to tell you. Yeah. About this.
You mentioned Stephanie Kelton, who maybe was the most famous. She wrote, like you mentioned, the book, The Deficit Myth, and she also was an advisor for Bernie Sanders. And then, of course, you mentioned Randall Wray, who's also one of the kind of the originators, as well as Mosler and Bill Mitchell. And they're all kind of from like, quote unquote, fringe academic settings, right? It's not like any of these people work at Harvard or Cambridge or Yale or Princeton. And to me, it seems like you have people, particularly say that are quote unquote progressive, say, so left of the political, they say left wing, right? And that they were basically searching for a way to justify spending all this money for their programs. And so they already had the idea, and then they searched out the academics to reinforce their point, is the way that I more or less see it. I mean, I don't think, then if you listen to like Stephanie, I've listened to a couple podcast by Stephanie Kelton, and you're more confused after you listen to her. It's just like a word salad because she can't really prove her points, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, I think MMTers are very confused. I've learned this on Twitter over the last couple of weeks because I've been having exchanges with MMTers, including Warren Mosler, who replied to one of my tweets. These people, they change definitions all the time. So they tell you something that's not quite right in a very authoritative way. They say, this is the way it is. When you point them a mistake, they reply, and you know what? Sometimes they reply with something that's technically correct, but the definitions are different. So they speak about something else, right? But then you point that out and they come back with another story of an exception that happened in South Africa when the government let, I don't know, the government borrowed money from Central. I'm like, okay, but why are we talking about this now? So yeah, it's word salads. It's very confusing. And I think to your point, this is very political, right? So these people have a political agenda. And that's unfortunately my conclusion from reading so much about MMT. I think that the theory is like 10% good. So there is a part that is actually interesting. And I think people should learn it. But then it's completely smeared by the politics because it starts okay. And then the moment they try to suggest policies and how we can actually use MMT for policymaking, it's extremely sloppy. The work collapses immediately. And a very good example of this is the paper that they wrote on the Green New Deal, how to pay for the Green New Deal, which is this package of environmental but also social measures in the US. And they say the MMT lens can be used to analyze this. How can we pay for it without thinking about debt, or like federal debt and stuff like that? The MMT says we shouldn't think about that. And the paper is so sloppy. Everything pays for itself, right? So they say we're going to pardon student debt or pay student debt and also make college free. Now, what will that cost to Americans? Nothing. Why? Because the economy will grow so much from this in terms of productivity gains that it pays for itself. But actually, it's like pretty much every component of this pays for itself, right? And they didn't even justify this, right? It's not a thorough paper where they actually studied this. It's just, they just assume it's going to pay for itself, right? And that's when you see that it seems that this is political activism that has found a theory to kind of justify expanding the government. I do get that feeling, yeah.
And what do you think about the Cantillon effect and MMT?
As in, that's the effect where inflation starts, where the money kind of goes in. Is that what you're asking?
Well, basically,
yeah.
It's, the people that, the closer you are to the money, say to the printing press, the digital printing press, whatever, the time, you get the money first, and inflation hasn't set in yet. So you actually have like real purchasing power. And then as money trickles down to the economy, the time the average person gets it, they're hit with inflation. So for them, the extra money isn't actually extra because it's offset by the increased prices. But say if you're one of the people at Davos or, one of the elites, you're actually buying houses with this new money at the old prices.
That's a very interesting point because there are different ways in which this money printing could operate, right? One way is to pay for ordinary spending of the government, the treasury, right? The treasury wants to build a hospital, right? It creates money, which is something that MMTers will probably support. That's what they're saying. And we need to understand that money would go quite directly to the hands of consumers. It's easy to imagine this could cause inflation. Now, MMTers will sometimes say, especially with paying off debt, they will point out that it's just an asset swap. Let's speak about this and why it's partially true only. Let's say a pension fund has bought government bonds, right? When people save money, when they buy government bonds, it's because they have excess money, right? So we think it's people who are retired and they put money in a pension pot, so it's not people who don't have money who invest, right? So that money is money people didn't want to use in the first place, right? So they give it to an investment fund, right? Now the investment funds needs to make this money work and generate a return. If the government were to create money to pay off that debt, it will be putting money in the hands of, let's say, pension funds, not in the hands of the public, right? That money goes into the pension fund. The pension fund gives those bonds back to the government and the debt is settled. What happens afterward is not like the people at the pension fund start spending the money. The effect is more subtle, right? They will want to get a return from that money because it doesn't collect an interest, right? So they're going to start extending loans to businesses potentially, or buy corporate loans. And then it's going to create inflation in a more subtle way by letting businesses carry out more projects, right? It's not going to go straight into the hands of a consumer. Another thing that could happen is that they're going to start buying stock or other riskier investments with this money, and then the prices of shares of companies they go up, those prices. And then people feel a bit richer, and they start maybe borrowing against collateral because the price has gone up. So what I've just described is quantitative easing, right? That's literally the mechanism, which is it is intended to generate inflation, right? Stephanie Kelton said if Japan were to pay off debt by doing this asset swap, she calls exchanging yellow dollars, bonds, against green dollars, like usual dollars. If the government does this, nobody will have to chip in a dime, she says. But that's quite inaccurate because it will probably trigger this mechanism of a subtle inflation that will creep in through the mechanisms I just explained, right? So there will be inflation. And then when there's inflation, that means that people who have any savings in the form of money, they will become poorer. So they are paying for this, right? People are chipping in a dime when the government does this. But I think it's a little bit disingenuous, I think, because printing money to fund the treasury, the ordinary spending, is quite obviously a bad idea. So MMTers are going to tell you, but no, it's just an asset swap. So they divert the conversation toward this more subtle thing of paying off debt, and they're going to say, look, we don't have inflation. We haven't had a lot of inflation, at least until 2021, even though the central bank was doing this quantitative easing, right? But I have to say, we probably did have inflation in terms of preventing deflation, right? That's why central banks did it. They were afraid prices would go down, which is a whole other conversation. They don't like the idea of deflation. So they kind of printed money to prevent deflation, which is the same as saying they've kind of generated inflation, actually. So it's more subtle, I would say, the mechanism, if you pay off debt compared to just go on a spending spree, Yeah, but both, I think, are expected to generate inflation.
If you read any book by any of the MMTers, whether it's Stephanie Kelton or was it Randall, Wray? Steve Keen even mentions this as well. But basically, they all say that taxes do not fund federal spending. Instead, taxes will create demand for the currency. They manage inflation, reallocate resources. Essentially, they redistribute wealth and they shape behavior. And like Wray in his book on MMT, I mean, he basically talks a lot about sin tax, and it should be a sin to be too wealthy. And so it's essentially, it just seems like they're trying to use this. That's why I said it's like the whole progressive, where they're trying to use it to re-engineer behavior. And if you can create money willy-nilly, then why are you so afraid of rich people, I guess? It's like, why is reallocating and redistributing money such a big part of it if money's not the issue?
I mean, they're going to tell you that there are real limits in the economy, the things that you can actually do. And they will say that inequality is a bad thing because some people are kind of, using up too many resources. So I think that's what they would tell you. But I would say a few things about this. First, even let's give them credit for this idea. Let's assume this is all right, what they're saying. Can we believe in practice that taxes will be used in this world where the government can print money if inflation goes up for any reason? taxes would be a way or the way of suppressing spending from the population, they would believe that politicians will, in practice, actually do this. They will be like, oh, inflation is going up, so let's increase taxes, which would be very unpopular, right? So in practice, even if we can discuss the theoretical aspects, it's very difficult to believe that politicians would actually do this. And this is why inflation control is given to the central bank, in an independent way, because politicians like to get reelected and stuff. So it's very, very unpopular to just increase taxes. So yes, MMTers say that taxes are not needed in reality because the government can just print money, but they have a few functions. One of them is to suppress inflation control when that's needed. But are you actually going to do that? Are you going to do that fast enough? Because, you can't just increase tax that easily, right? And say, oh, it's just suppressing inflation. So I think it's a bit hard to believe that this would work well in practice, So yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to say before we even start. It's very, very hard to believe. And then, yes, there are other hypothetical reasons in this world why taxes are needed. Because that's one of the criticisms of MMT. Is if the government can just print money, why do we even need taxes? We're going to tell you for inflation control. They're going to tell you to drive demand for the currency, to make the currency accepted, to make it the currency that people actually use. And then they're going to tell you for redistribution of wealth, right? So that rich people can give up on their spending whenever we need to do public works and stuff. And then also to deter behavior that is considered not good, like smoking, right? Which is like a minor point. Right? It's like, why do you need taxes? Well, because smoking is not good. Another thing I'm going to tell you, when inflation went up in 2021, you didn't hear all these MMTers say taxes should go up. Which is, okay, if this is the way in your world, you will be controlling inflation. So why? So that proves that it's a bit hard to believe that in practice they would be using taxes to control inflation.
Yeah, you're originally from Argentina. I mean, you live in London right now, and you went to, I believe your undergrad is in Buenos Aires in Argentina as well. I think you maybe did you get your PhD in like France?
Yeah.
Or right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you grew up, and I think was it 1989 was the first real big hyperinflation event in Argentina, and they've had several since then. I believe in 2023 they also had a hyperinflation event. So how much of your book, if you can just print money, why do I pay taxes? How much was this inspired from growing up in Argentina, going through hyperinflation, and your family? It sounds like some of them still live there. Like you go back, and you mentioned in the book, like you go back and you visit your family. Yeah. So, you have one story where you're basically at a table at dinner and, you're having to pull out a suitcase of money to pay for, it's like rice and beans or something. Like, oh, okay, let me roll in 3 suitcases of money so I can settle the bill.
Yeah, it's quite funny because, I moved out of Argentina in 2014. Inflation had gone up over the past few years. So the hyperinflation of the 80s was before I was born, actually. But my parents remember that. And prices were going up so quickly that people would just go and buy oil, like cooking oil, just not to have money in their hands. Then there was a period of stability in terms of inflation, which lasted until maybe the 2010-ish, maybe a bit earlier. So I lived the beginning of inflation again, not getting that high. But I remember this thing of, any recurring payment, like a gym subscription. It's like, it's going up every month now, right? And the highest denomination, the highest valued bill, like banknote, is becoming kind of useless, right? And the government started lying about inflation. And this is public knowledge. Like they acknowledged later that they was just, everybody knew that this was, and then there was price controls, right? So they tried to stop inflation by reaching agreements with supermarkets on certain products that they couldn't increase the prices, but you would never find them, and the shelves were empty in many places. So I hear, all of this stuff going on, and I move out of the country in 2014, but I go back once in a while, and things escalate horribly. after I moved out, to the point that now whenever I go back, I just can't believe it, because I think it was 2 years ago, I go for dinner with my extended family, and we had to pay the bill, and the credit card machine isn't working. So my aunt is like, oh, well, I'll pay cash. And she opens her handbag, and there's like rolls of banknotes, organized with like elastic bands. It's like, and you just see all this cash, like hundreds of banknotes on the table. And this was like an ordinary restaurant, right? This is not a fancy place. It's like a regular meal, and it's like it costs a fortune, in nominal terms at least. Because every banknote is worth less and less and less, and prices, I think, between two trips, I think they were multiplied by like 7 between two trips, and Argentinians are quite miserable because of this. You can see that the GDP and stuff is not so bad. It's not like it's not one of the poorest countries. It's not a rich country, but you can tell that people are very unhappy about this because it's very hard to do business in a world like mortgages don't exist. People do not buy a house by getting a mortgage. That's pretty much unheard of as of late, because who wants to lend you money when they don't know what interest rate to charge, because this is like so unstable. So people actually have to get all the cash, they actually pay in cash. If you want to buy a house, you literally go with a suitcase with maybe $50,000 to the real estate agency. And this is all legit. This is not like this is legit. You go, you have to declare where money comes from, but houses are purchased using dollars, US dollar cash, because people don't want to collect that amount of money in pesos, because in a few days, potentially, it's just losing value, right? So a lot of things are completely insane in Argentina. And when you move to a more stable economy, like I lived in France and now I live in the UK, and then I start hearing this theory, MMT, which pretty much says, let's print money. That's not going to cause inflation. And if inflation were to happen, we're going to increase taxes. And also lately, they've been saying we can also implement price controls. So a few years later, I was surprised when I started hearing about this theory called MMT, which says the government should print money. They can raise taxes if inflation were to happen, but it won't happen. And then also we can use price controls if, to tame inflation. That's something else MMTers have been saying as of late. And I had a sense of deja vu. I was like, I lived through this. It didn't work in Argentina. So how's it different? How do MMTers suggest doing things differently? Right. And that definitely triggered my curiosity. And that's why I also wanted to learn more about MMT.
I find it interesting, as we talked about some of the credentials of some of the MMTers a little while ago. But basically, all of the MMTers are located in the United States, with the exception of Bill Mitchell, who's at the University of Newcastle in Australia. Because essentially the gist of the MMT is just that if you have your own currency, you can print as much money as you want. People are forced to use it because they have to pay taxes. And you can't really ever run out of money because you could always just kind of print more. But in the U.S., the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency. A lot of oil and other commodities are priced in U.S. dollars. But what if you're in a small country, and like you're from Argentina, but what if you're in Venezuela or something, where, on the black market, people want dollars. But if you're in a small country, are you able to just print money? Or even like a bigger country like Japan, if everything is kind of pegged to the dollar, are you really able, like, while that country might have sovereignty over its own money supply, you still have the global economy. So it's not really, I think, with the exception of the U.S., that's why I think a lot of these MMTers come out of the U.S. with the exception of one of them.
Yeah, some people accuse MMTers of being short-sighted because they focus a lot on the U.S. situation. People say the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. I think even that may be a little bit exaggerated. The U.S. can have inflation. It has had inflation, and there is more demand for U.S. dollars, domestic and international, than there is demand for the Argentinian peso. But there's still a finite demand. Right? If you start creating money to pay for government spending without withdrawing that money from circulation, then you will probably experience inflation at some point. I think, look, MMTers say lots of things, but when they look at countries like Argentina, what they do is, first of all, they say the government is just not effective at collecting taxes, and that's why they have inflation. Because to them, it's always this story of, taxes don't exist to pay for government spending. It's just for inflation control and other things. They say there is tax evasion in those countries, but they've never provided a number to say, okay, which percentage of GDP, for example, should taxes be for the currency to be properly accepted and not have inflation, let's say. It is kind of very, very fuzzy with regards to that. Sometimes they just dismiss. Actually, it's a bit upsetting what they do, because when they analyze emerging economies, let's say, like in South America, they say, oh, people are just used to using US dollars, so they don't accept quite the national currency. One of them said it was maybe due to ignorance, which I thought was a bit of a big statement. And this is written in a paper. It's not like he was saying it at a podcast. It's like, among other reasons, people's ignorance, right? And that's why they use the US dollar. And that's why the local currency suffers from inflation. That's because people don't quite accept it enough. But I think it's upside down. People use US dollars in Argentina for lots of things because of inflation in the first place, right? So they can't manage the domestic currency properly, right? And then people experience inflation, and they feel like trying to save using Argentinian pesos is like having icicles that are melting, right? So you need to switch that as fast as you can, exchange it for US dollars, right? It's not like people use US dollars out of the blue just because they're ignorant. And that's why they don't support the local currency. But that's kind of the story that MMTers will tell you. Let me tell you something else about all these episodes of inflation that coincided with money printing. Like in the 1920s in Europe, right? In Germany, famously, in Zimbabwe, the 2000s, and Argentina repeatedly. There's always money creation in those episodes. So what do MMTers have to say about this? They will always point to something else that was happening that was actually accurate. For example, Argentina had debt in foreign currency. Germany was suffering from very high reparation payments that they had to make to other countries after the war. But look, I'll tell you a very simple story. There's a friend of mine that lost his passport 4 times in a year. 4 times in a year. Now they gave him like a different kind of passport that expires in in a year, and they made him go to an appointment because it's kind of really weird. Someone will lose his passport, and he always has an excuse for it. One time the passport was stolen. Another time the pocket, whatever, it was the jeans were the problem. But I feel like probably, even though it's true that there's a trigger every time, you are probably not taking good care of your passport. And what happened in countries like Argentina and Venezuela is that it is true that there was a trigger that caused the money printing, right? In the case of Venezuela, for example, it was when the price of oil went down, and then the government's not collecting as much revenue as before, and it starts creating money almost automatically to keep up the previous level of spending. What MMTers do is they point to those things that triggered, in Zimbabwe, the collapse of agricultural production. That's true. That caused an initial surge of inflation. But what happened afterward is that the central banks started subsidizing agriculture like crazy and creating money for it. And that's when they got the hyperinflation. So what they're always going to do is every inflation is different according to them. And there was a trigger, which is true. This is all technically true. But in reality, and there's some studies about this, what happened a lot in South America is that countries were too quick to print money almost automatically whenever something happened to the budget, right? It's like, yes, the price of oil, or in case of Argentina, there was a drought, the agriculture, less tax revenue from agriculture. And they have this tendency to just, let's pretty much automatically start creating money, right? So there's a focus always on this excuse, which is, and this is something MMTers do a lot. They say things that are true, technically, but they miss the bigger picture. So yes, Zimbabwe agricultural production collapsed. Prices are expected to go up when that happens. So they're right about that. But what about all this money printing that happened afterward, to subsidize agriculture? So there's always this kind of incomplete truth. And that's what makes MMT so dangerous also, because they are right about certain things that they say, And on that note, a lot of the accounting things that MMT says are kind of pretty obvious. Yes, it is true that we could technically let the government print money, right? We could. Everybody knows that. The question is always the economic consequences of doing that. Most economists say this is not a good idea, right? But sometimes MMTers, they point to they mention something really obvious, like, yeah, of course, if we change the rules, we could let the treasury, create as much money as it wants. Like, everybody knows this, right? That has never been the question. The question has always been, what are the consequences of letting the government print money, right? And when you point out those counterexamples like Argentina, Venezuela, they're always going to go on a tangent and tell you, look what happened with oil prices, and Venezuela having issues with, some other political turmoil. So it's never the money printing. But it's a kind of very sly way of proving these points.
Basically, a lot of the MMTers will always say the government is not a household. And of course, your household just can't roll out a printer and start printing cash. I guess if you did, you might find yourself in prison. But I was reading Paul Sheard's book, The Power of Money, which came out a few years ago. And Paul Sheard used to be the global chief economist at Lehman Brothers. And he also is a council expert for the World Economic Forum, or the WEF. And in his book, Power of Money, he basically gives an example, because everyone talks about how much debt like the U.S. has. The U.S. has cleared $38 trillion this year. And so I'm just going to kind of update his numbers. But he gets rid of some zeros to make it more kind of like plain English, so to speak. So instead of using trillions, he does it in just thousands. But he says that the U.S. economy, which produced about $30 trillion of GDP. So he says, if I had a job paying $30,500 a year and I owed $38,400, I probably could handle things pretty well. And I'm not even the government. And so when you hear $38 trillion in debt, but you also have a $30 trillion economy, like I said, if you did reduce those numbers, I mean, if the average person making $30,000 a year, probably, if they have a mortgage, they might be a couple $100,000 in debt. A car payment, another $20,000. Maybe student loans, they're probably several $100,000 in debt, and they're probably not too worried about paying off those debts. And they also don't have the ability to print money. So, I mean, he kind of makes the numbers a little bit more digestible. But what do you think about that point? Because you do hear a lot of people freaking out about this $38 trillion debt.
Yeah, I don't know if you compare that to GDP or to the tax collection, right? Because the size of the economy, that's not how much money the government collects, from taxes to pay off debt. But there is a place for debt, right? So there is a place for debt, just like with a household, because sometimes you want to buy a house and you're going to get a loan. So it's not that government debt necessarily is always a bad thing. Right. What I think, some people are worried about the sustainability of debt. MMTers will be like, no, that doesn't make any sense. We can print money. But we need to understand that what economists are worried about is debt in real terms. In real terms, we're talking about economic production, right? When people lend money to the government, right? Again, even if it's no real debt, whatever MMT says, they have an IOU, which means the government needs to pay you that money back one day, which means that economic resources will move around the economy, right? Because the people who are creditors, when they lend money, what they expect is in the future, they will be able to afford more stuff than before. They will have the right to purchase more real things, right? If you do not, fulfill this commitment to these people, then why would they give you money? Because in real terms, debt means today I will not spend on things. I will not spend on consumption. I will not get another Netflix subscription, or and I will withhold my spending to lend money, right, in real terms too, so that the government can mobilize resources. So a hospital will be built and fewer Netflix shows will be produced. This is how resources move, and that's the role of debt in real terms, right? So today we withhold our pleasures in life so that the government can actually get stuff done, for the future. But in exchange for that, that means that in the future, I will be able to kind of consume a bit more Netflix and other, on holidays, because I withheld my consumption in the present. That's the deal. That's the social contract, if you want. So the debt, I don't know if it's sustainable or not. I haven't done the maths, but the debt is a commitment to the people who actually withheld their consumption, right? And in the future, you have to compensate those people. And there are two ways in which you can default on your payments toward those people. The first one is that you could default technically, you just don't pay them, right? But you can also default economically, which is something that MMTers sometimes do not say. If there is a bout of unexpected inflation because the government went and printed money, right? The people who were expecting this payment, they're not going to be able to do much with that money, or not as much as they thought. So they are defaulting economically, right? So a person withheld consumption, they decided not to get that Netflix subscription. Again, a bit of a silly example, right? But I decided to spend less or not go on that holiday because I thought in the future, thanks to this, suppressing this urge to consume, in the future, I'll get more than what I gave, right? I'll get to go on a holiday and a half or in 2 holidays in the future, right? That's how it works. But then when the government defaults economically, you just don't get that payment. Yet now you can't even go on a single holiday because the money is worth less. So I think it's good to understand the dynamics of debt, both in terms of money, but also in terms of resources, in terms of real terms, which is something that I feel people sometimes ignore.
We're kind of mentioning a little bit off the air what's going on with Argentina and the U.S. government. You kind of want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm fascinated by what's going on in Argentina. For starters, because people are talking about Argentina, which they usually don't speak about Argentina much, and then all of a sudden, it's no longer about football or soccer. It's all about politics. What's going on, and it's fascinating. But what happened essentially, Milei got elected on a libertarian platform. In Argentina, there's been a political ideology that has been ruling the country for a very long time, and there haven't been many periods where it hasn't been in power. These people who belong to this ideology called Peronism or Peronism, from Peron, the guy who was married to Evita, the musical. So it's been around since the 40s, the same people. And they have done a lot of this, a lot of money printing. There have been lots of episodes of inflation. It's always kind of big government. It's left-wing populism sort of thing, especially as of late. And it's sometimes even the same families, people and the relatives being in power after the, it's like the husband and the wife, and the son has a political appointment and stuff like that. And I think in the latest inflation episode, we're talking 2000, things got worse. What was it, like 2018 started to escalate. People got very upset. I have the feeling that they thought we need an alternative. And they voted for Milei, right? Javier Milei, which is this kind of a very, very crazy guy. The way he became pretty famous by going to talk shows and insulting people, right? But his idea was we need to make the government smaller, and we're going to stop the money printing. And when he took office, he did that, actually. He surprisingly managed to eliminate the government deficit almost immediately. And inflation went down very quickly. It's still high, to be honest, compared to the rest of the world, but it's tenfold down, right? It's abrupt. Like, people from Argentina are telling me, I remember the price of something. I go to the supermarket kind of expecting it's going to be this much in a ballpark, which wasn't the case before. Before they just go blindly to the supermarket. And this is very similar to how disinflation happened in other places, like in the 1920s. and Germany and Austria and Poland and Hungary. They literally cut down government spending. And it helped, that debt was restructured and stuff. But it was pretty much immediate how the inflation went down very quickly. So it's another time where, when you control government spending, especially the kind of government spending that is funded by money creation, which was the case quite a lot in Argentina, inflation comes down, but then you'll hear two stories. Right? There's a story of this is because money printing has stopped, but then other people will tell you this is because there's a huge recession and everyone's even more miserable than before and consumption has gone down, and that's why there is disinflation. It's not really because things are getting better, it's actually because they're getting worse. But either way, I think we're going to be able to tell in maybe a couple of years how it goes. But right now, inflation seems to keep going down. But there was a very, very strange thing that happened a couple of months ago, which is that the US gave Argentina a sort of lifeline in the form of $20 billion. They bought Argentinian pesos. And again, this is an episode that is very, very controversial. A lot of people will call it even illiberal, right? Because it's kind of getting a bailout from foreign government, when you're a libertarian. And you're just like, so it's very controversial. And there was this American guy that asked me a few weeks ago, will the US ever get its money back? Right? And we can go a little bit deeper into why this sort of loan or currency swap took place. I think Argentinians are quite addicted to pretending that they're richer than they are in a way, right? They love their exchange rate against the US dollar to be good, to be strong. That makes imports into the country cheaper, for example, right? And Milei liberalized currency exchange, which was very controlled before. But he established a band. He was like, I want the exchange rate to move between these two sides. But then all of a sudden, it kind of starts getting worse and worse and worse and reaching this limit where he will have to intervene if he wants the peso not to collapse, right? One of the reasons, so it's not just that things were out of control. One of the reasons for this to happen was that there was some sort of local election or kind of a irrelevant election, but he didn't do well in that election, right? And the markets thought, okay, the old regime is going to come back, which means more inflation, which means the peso will lose its value, and that kind of started pushing the price of the peso away from that. And that's when the Trump administration offered injecting lots of US dollars into Argentina to help maintain the value of the currency. And again, you can analyze this from different angles. I'm just telling you what happened. A few weeks later, there's the midterm election in Argentina. Works very similarly to the US. I don't have to explain it to you, but in the UK, you kind of have to explain how this works. But in the midterm election, I spoke to everyone in Argentina, and everyone said Milei is going to lose horribly. Not him, because it's not a presidential election, but his party is going to lose horribly. Why? Because everyone is so upset. The government has shrunk. Everyone's poor. But essentially, everybody told me, I am going to still vote for Milei, but nobody else will, right? That's kind of what I heard from the ground. A little bit biased, maybe, because the people who I know in Argentina are maybe, they were all very tired of the previous regime and they voted for Milei. Not everyone, but a lot of people I know. And just as this happened, I'm reading a book by Alizina, this Italian economist. The book is called Austerity, and it's actually a pretty good book. This guy, he studied lots of episodes of austerity that happened in the world in the past few decades. And one of his points in the book is austerity. Everyone says you lose an election if you implement austerity. But he says that there were many episodes of austerity in the past, many examples, especially the kind of austerity where the government was shrunk, not the taxes went up, where actually governments have been reelected. But what you hear on the ground is, no, the government cannot be reelected because this is a disaster. But the people saying this are often the people who lose the most from austerity. So people who have an interest in government spending, but that doesn't always reflect what the people in general think. And that's why even despite that, governments can get reelected. And just as I finished reading this book, the election takes place in Argentina, where everybody thought it's going to lose. And he won by quite a landslide, which is very surprising, despite all of this cutting government spending. And he still won pretty big in Argentina, and the party was, won lots of seats in Congress, and which kind of proves that, economically what he's doing. Maybe people didn't like the alternative, because they didn't necessarily like Milei or his policies, but they pretty much don't want to go back to the previous regime. But it was all quite insane. So when you go from like insane inflation, we're talking, it was at least 300% in the best case scenario, kind of at the time Milei took office. Then it goes down dramatically. Money printing stopped completely. So if you look at the balance sheet of the central bank, which I have gone through, it goes from like an insane amount of money printing to like nothing all of a sudden. Inflation goes down, but then things started getting a bit weird. And then Trump bailout, and then re-election. It's just like a very, very strange thing that happened in Argentina. If I had to give you my personal opinion on Argentina, is that I think economically what Milei is doing makes sense. It does make sense. Politically, he is a big weirdo, and he is very controversial. He has very strong opinions on the Israel-Palestine conflict. I don't even know why a country with such big issues has to worry so much about, Israel, but he speaks a lot about Israel. So it's like lots of, he has very bad manners. So politically, it's a big salad, but economically, I think what he's trying to do makes sense, but what Argentina needs now is economic growth. It means it needs to develop as a country. By reducing inflation, you do not achieve economic growth just by itself. It's good to have stability. But I'm going to tell you one thing. In Argentina, there's not a single motorway that connects the country north to south. It's a very long country, 3,000 miles north to south, right? The road on the west side of the country used to be a dirt road until not so long ago. The one on the east side is not a motorway. It's like a single lane road, which means if you want to transport goods across the country without trains, because there aren't many trains, it's a nightmare. It's a country that struggles to move stuff within the country. That makes doing business in Argentina very difficult. Like, that's just one example, right? And for prosperity, you need to develop infrastructure. You need lots of things that are not there, So I think that, to me, it's a big question mark, because what's going to happen now? You need many, many years of stability, of investment, of developing a country that is not developed in that sense. And I don't know what's going to happen.
What do you think of Bitcoin? I see Bitcoin's price right now today is right around $93,000. Is that a solution to some of the monetary problems in countries? I mean, that's what we always hear about, like the Bitcoin maximalists and whatnot. But
yeah, I think I struggle a little bit with Bitcoin sometimes, because the people who support Bitcoin, they have concerns. Right? But sometimes it's difficult to see exactly what the concerns are and why Bitcoin is a solution to that specific concern. So one concern is inflation specifically. You can see this a lot. There's this guy, I don't know how to say his name. I think it's Saifidian, or I don't know how to say it. But yeah,
the Greek guy, right? The Bitcoin,
the Bitcoin standard.
Yeah.
You can see the Bitcoin standard is like 100 pages in which he's actually complaining about inflation. And he complains from the point of view of people not being able to preserve the value of their savings. Because also, sometimes people go from another angle, which is it's undemocratic what governments do, because they often create money, like, World War I wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have lasted that long on a gold standard. So you can hear lots of things. But I think his bigger concern tends to be inflation erodes people's savings, right? And my concern with like Bitcoin being a solution to that is it, right? So first of all, there are other ways of preserving savings. The idea that the currency you use for your daily life transactions is the same thing that should be how you preserve your savings is, it's not necessarily, I don't know, but should it be the same thing? Because right now, if you want to preserve your savings, there are ways of doing that. You could buy stock shares of companies, right? You can complain that prices are going up, but if you buy shares of those companies, it tends to beat inflation. So there are ways and also Bitcoin is very volatile. And we saw like a 30% drop this year. So this idea that we can preserve our savings with Bitcoin is still a bit like, there are also other things that could be discussed in terms of currently central banks, they tend to target 2% a year inflation, right? That could be changed potentially to 0% or even deflation to match increases in productivity, which is something George Selgin says, which kind of makes sense. Like if we're becoming better at producing stuff, shouldn't stuff become cheaper, right? So there are other ways even within a fiat monetary system that inflation could be targeted differently, right? So even though I understand what Bitcoiners are coming from, a bigger picture conversation would say, okay, if your concern is inflation, what are other ways of fighting against inflation? What are other ways of preserving your wealth? Is Bitcoin an actual solution to that? Because when you see the volatility that it can have, is that actually a good way of preserving wealth? So those are some of my concerns with Bitcoin, is that I feel like lots of things are kind of mixed in that conversation. Is that they're debasing the currency. Yeah, they are. They do that on purpose, like 2% a year at least. They do that. But they also do that for a reason, which you may not like. But they could also target inflation differently without us all switching to Bitcoin. But then if you bought Bitcoin at the wrong time, then you could really have a very big drawdown in terms of your savings, right? If that's what you were trying to do. Also, they often compare Bitcoin to commodities, like gold. But again, gold has some uses. You could actually use it to produce shiny objects that people want to buy. Bitcoin, again, sometimes I struggle to see the use of Bitcoin, even though it can be used for certain things, but it's not very good for transactions because it's kind of very slow. So I feel like there's a mix of lots of things. And then we have even this other problem, like this book, The Bitcoin Standard, ends up saying, yes, it's bad for transactions, but it could be used as bank reserves. If you remember earlier today, we spoke about banks settle transactions at the end of the day by using what's called reserves. What if they use Bitcoin for that, right? But then what about this fractional money system that we have, where like we said, commercial banks can create money when they lend money out. The total amount of money would still fluctuate potentially, even though reserves are Bitcoin, but then we can imagine that doesn't actually completely control the money supply, because we would probably have to be very strict about what banks can do in terms of, creating money. So there's like a whole bunch of things. So yeah, I don't know if this answers your question. There's more questions than answers I have here, but I feel like it's a more subtle debate that needs to be had about Bitcoin.
Who created Bitcoin? Who is Satoshi Nakamoto? My theory is it's just the CIA, and like a CIA or NSA. I think it's something like that. I mean, who created Tor? It was the U.S. Navy. Who created the SHA algorithm? It was the NSA of the U.S. So, and even one of the who was one of the early Bitcoin maintainers. Was it Mike Hearn? It was I forget his name, but he actually met with the CIA back in the day. He even talks about it. So
wow, I didn't know that. Yeah. I don't know who that guy that the creator of Bitcoin was or is, but I think it was very clever what he did. Like the algorithm, this idea of, because think about this computationally, right? Because what is Bitcoin actually trying to solve for people maybe who don't or haven't learned about this before? The idea is that you want a ledger of transactions, of money transactions, and also with a money supply that can be altered. And so the idea is you don't want any centralized power to be able to alter this ledger or even the amount of money in existence, right? Imagine you put a record of money, who has how much, which is how it works today. And so I'm going to put it very safely in a computer in a specific country that has laws that prevent the government from fiddling with this. Well, that's not quite safe, actually, in terms of not letting anyone alter this, because you can imagine foreign governments using embargoes or sanctions to try to intervene, right? So there are ways in which if that ledger is centralized anywhere, there are ways for a government to intervene. So this guy comes up with an idea of a decentralized ledger, right, that is maintained in many places at the same time that you can't really alter simultaneously. Like, it's pretty much impossible to do that by a single entity or an organization. And he came up with a clever mathematical algorithm to do this. So it's fascinating. It's like a great idea, I think. And he solved, at least theoretically, this is a problem that is fascinating to formulate. And then he found a solution to it. And I think that's fascinating. And I can see some value in being able to create piece of data or ledger that can be altered by easily, but by a single entity, right? This is what the blockchain is, right? So I think it's fascinating. We can see how this currency could, how currency could be used that runs on this technology. But then there are lots of practical issues and practical limitations of this, because having so much redundant computation all over the world comes with baggage, right? It's very slow to process payments so then you have all these wallets, that people actually don't have the Bitcoin. It's like you have an account with a broker that says this is your Bitcoin, but in reality they are settling the transactions at the end of the day. So a lot of people think they have Bitcoin, but they actually own Bitcoin. So all of this happens because of practical issues with Bitcoin.
What do you think Bitcoin will get up to at some point? I mean, it cleared a 120 not too long ago. Do you think we'll ever see 250? I mean, I know a lot of Bitcoiners talk about $1 million coin, 1 million per Bitcoin. I don't know if I ever see that, but what do you think's the ceiling of it?
I don't know, because one thing is what could happen in practice. There could be even an irrational bubble, like it could go anywhere. But my issue with Bitcoin is that I think any asset, the intrinsic value of an asset at the end of the day and in the long term is how many services it provides to you. That tends to be the value of an asset, right? And when you buy a house, the value of the house is correlated with the value of the service it provides, which is sheltering people, accommodation. If you had to pay rent, you can actually do the calculation and you end up getting, very close to, you just think of the future payments in terms of rental that you're actually not paying because you own your place, and you do some maths and you get to a value of your house that tends to be kind of correlated with it. But then we have the 2008 issue, right? And with Bitcoin, to me, it's also, let's say Bitcoin goes to 2050, right? 250,000, sorry. What if it's lashed the day after to 1/10 of that? I don't see why that wouldn't happen also, because I don't see what service Bitcoin is providing, right? That is my issue with the calculation of the word speculation. I've used that word before, but I think I actually understood what it meant from an economist from Northern Ireland who said something like, it's just when you buy something because you think the price will go up, not because of the fundamental value of it. And I think a lot of the value of Bitcoin, if you ask people, it's kind of a circular explanation. They tell you Bitcoin is valuable because it's a store of value. Why is it a store of value? Because it's scarce and stuff. Yeah, but there are lots of things that are scarce, and scarcity doesn't necessarily provide a service. So one service Bitcoin could provide would be being really a go-to thing for transactions, potentially in the future. This benefits from network effects. When everyone's using Bitcoin, taking Bitcoin for payments and stuff, maybe potentially that would be the service it provides. It does provide that service already for some transactions. Like we can see that in illegal markets, people do use Bitcoin. But then if you tell me, should it be, right now it's like 93, you said? If I told you tomorrow will be 9, so why would it be 93 or 9 or anything? Because with a house, if you tell me my house will go from 500,000 to 50,000 tomorrow, I would say probably not, because when you look at how much rental income you can collect from that, 50 would be a bargain. People would want to pay a lot more for the house, right? Because of the return they get on the investment. But with Bitcoin, I still don't see what that service is. That's why I struggle a little bit to understand where the value of Bitcoin comes from.
you are the author of several books on artificial intelligence. You also are a computer scientist. You work with AI. You're a consultant. You build these AI systems. And you have a pretty big presence on LinkedIn. So I'm looking at a post that you wrote on LinkedIn from 5 days ago. And this is what you say, quote, "Did you know this is the third AI bubble? There were two already in the early 1970s, early 1980s. They both crashed dramatically. This time is different in one way. AI is here to stay and we'll use it in our daily lives. However, there will still be a crash as AI-based companies will make much less money than promised." So, I mean, you had Michael Burry recently come out. Basically, he's shorting it. You've had other people come out and say the accounting is similar to Enron. You had the CEO of Nvidia saying we're not the next Enron, which makes you wonder if you actually are the next Enron. If you have to tell people, like it's the whole thing. If an athlete says I'm going from, say, like the Chicago Bears to the Minnesota Vikings, and it's not about the money, then you know that the reason they're switching teams is because it's all about the money, right? They're telling you why by not telling you why, right? So question here is, if we are in an AI bubble, how severe is this going to be, and when does it finally hit? I mean, there's people that are saying this bubble is going to be 11 times the size of the dot-com bubble and 4 times the size of the great financial crash. The great financial crash destroyed economies around the globe for years. I mean, if this is 4 times that size, I mean, do we need to start building underground bunkers and getting cans of food because we're going to be, kind of screwed? Or do I need to put my money into Bitcoin? I mean, what's going on here?
I think first thing, I think AI is pretty awesome when we see the things, and I am surprised. Lately, people are using Gemini a lot, and it's like the new thing, which is going to be pretty bad for OpenAI. People are loving Gemini a little too much, and this technology is here to stay. So it's not that there's a bubble in terms, AI actually doesn't work, and I think people will use AI a lot in their daily lives, and they're already doing it. So that for sure, the technology, and it's different from previous bubbles because before it was more of an academic exercise, AI, and there was investment from business, but then it was kind of small scale at the time, and, but now we have this, this technology is definitely very, very impressive. I think the bubble is in the business side of AI, and we need to distinguish two kinds of AI companies. You have the providers of AI, the people who create the AI. OpenAI is one example, right? But then there's a whole economy around people who are building startups that are based on AI. So they build products on top of this foundational AI. We can call it an AI wrapper. So they can think of these people who say, I'm going to build an app that will use AI to help people with anxiety or with ADHD or to practice yoga, right? And these people think they're going to make a lot of money, right? So you have, if you want, a bubble in both. A bubble is a strong word, but let's just call it a bubble anyway. But there are these two economies. You got the big players like OpenAI. You got Nvidia selling the shovels, right? Because it's actually making a lot of money from selling GPUs, which is machines for AI developers. But then you have all of these startups getting money from venture capitalists, from the government sometimes. The government wants to incentivize AI, so they give grants to startups. So let's not ignore this other side of things. I don't know how dramatic the crash would be and what the impact would be to the wider economy. My intuition tells me it's not necessarily as bad as with 2008. We may not notice it that much because I don't know how deep it goes. In 2008, a lot of people had mortgages. They bought property, and I think it could have impacted the wider population a bit more. And I don't know how much people are insulated now from that. I don't think so many people have invested in AI startups, so I don't know what's going to happen. But yeah, it's a very big question. But I think there's definitely a frenzy going on. The reason why the foundational companies are going to struggle, like OpenAI, is that they don't actually have a moat. They don't have a competitive advantage. The technology is publicly known. We know how to build AI because it's been published in scientific papers, right? So when DeepSeek built this model that was as good as OpenAI models, I wasn't surprised because it was like, we know how to build what OpenAI built. So at some point, someone else will do it. And now we have DeepSeek and now Gemini kind of beating OpenAI. And when that happens, you have a commodity product and companies competing on price. And the problem is unit economics here, right? It's like a lot of compute power, a lot of spending to build these models, and then they're charging not so much in subscription fees. And people are going to kind of shop around a lot for the cheapest AI when they all become so similar. So that's a very basic commoditization of a product that leads to profits dwindling, right? So that would be the problem for those companies. When it comes to Nvidia or companies like Intel, like companies that sell infrastructure shovels, maybe they're the ones who will make actual money from this. I don't know if the crash will be so bad. Some people are saying they have a lot of unsold inventory, which is not a good sign. If they're building GPUs and they're not able to sell them, but I don't know what's going on. But that is definitely very strange. If the hardware that they're producing is piling up and not selling, so maybe they're producing too many shovels, in the gold rush. But yeah, I think there are lots of issues with unit economics and with this lack of moat. And then with the other sector, all the startups that build on top of AI. It's actually a very similar problem, which is the lack of a competitive advantage. You're doing things that there will be a flood of yoga apps based on AI. It's not going to be, you're not going to be unique, and probably not going to make money from that because everybody can do it, right? So yeah, don't know if this answers your question in any way. I don't know what to tell you. Should you go and buy Bitcoin? I don't know.
I was reading recently an article that to compare this bubble to the dot-com bubble is just an apples and oranges comparison. And what I was reading was that at the height of the dot-com bubble, that there was somewhere around 7,000 to 10,000 internet-related companies that were already received funding, outside funding. And what's going on right now with AI, it's essentially a dozen companies that are receiving almost all the money. And most of them are already big companies. Like you mentioned, Google has Gemini. You have OpenAI, which is kind of a new player in the space, but they're also funded by Microsoft. And then, of course, you have Nvidia, which is already a massive company before this even started. You have, there's a couple other small, Perplexity, maybe Anthropic. There's a few that are new players to the space. But, I guess you could say Grok, but that's Elon Musk, with Twitter and whatnot. So he's already one of the richest people in the world. So the question is, like last time, 20 years ago, you had 7,000 to 10,000 companies, and the vast majority of them were just absolutely eviscerated. In this particular case, Google makes a crap ton of money. Facebook makes a bunch of money. Like Microsoft makes a bunch of money, and it's more of like a CapEx kind of bubble this time, but these companies actually have profits. So is this a good comparison to compare to the dot-com, or is it just a completely different comparison from that standpoint?
That's a good question. And I think there are definitely differences to the scale of it, for starters. And it's true, you have these big companies that seem to be investing in each other. Also, there's a sort of circular thing going on. For some of these companies, like I said, it's CapEx investments. So it will be, if things don't go the way that they planned. I mean, for Google, it may be actually a very good investment to rule this AI world because it's helping them with their own search engine, right? People may still go to Google if they see good search results, or they will go to Gemini, and they will capture that audience that was kind of they were losing from the search traffic. So I think it could be good potentially for Google. But however, when you look at OpenAI, you're like, I think there are chances that the company may have serious issues because it's burning billions every year and there's no route to profitability. But I think if I had to predict what's going to happen with these big companies. I think there will be some sort of restructuring. A company will be absorbed by another company. Microsoft has invested a lot in OpenAI, right? So maybe it's not like a company will collapse and be liquidated. I think things will restructure potentially, and something like that could happen, I think. But I don't know. Yeah, it's true. It's very, very powerful. Yeah.
Who do you think will be some of the winners and the losers in this then, say, if we're looking the next 5 years out? When I was trying to think about who are going to be the winners, I go back to the early days of the internet, and the real catalyst for these companies in those days wasn't even out yet, which was the iPhone. And, you couldn't predict that all of a sudden how the iPhone, even though there was already smartphones that predated the iPhone, but once the iPhone came out, all of a sudden now, again, let's not forget, social media predated the iPhone, but once the iPhone came out, now social media took off because everyone had a camera, everyone had a camcorder essentially in their pocket, and you could post so easily. And now all of a sudden you needed to have cloud computing because the phone didn't actually have the compute and the processing power. Then you had to create faster wireless internet and things like that to be able to fully unlock it. And I don't necessarily think that we actually have the iPhone moment yet for AI, because in its current iteration, the companies want to shove it down your throat. It's like you're on YouTube or you're on X, and it's like, oh, let AI give you a summary, or there's just it's just a way for them to try to pad the number of people using it. But it basically, it's like they have the answer, but no one's asking the question, right? My point is the iPhone moment isn't here yet. And let's not forget the iPhone didn't come out until halfway through 2007, quite a few years after the height of the dot-com bubble. And we're in, maybe 2031, 2032.
I think like a lot of people have changed the way they do things dramatically. I haven't personally much in the kind of work I do, but I see people use AI for everything sometimes. And the way they consume information is very different, right? They go to AI to ask questions. My problem is with reliability a lot. It doesn't actually do a perfect job, for sure it doesn't, but it's not that great of a job. But anyway, people are relying on this for coding, for searching for information. So I think a lot of people will say this was like an iPhone moment for them, because it changed the way they did things. I've seen people create images or videos. This is usually for things where good enough is okay, where you don't need super high quality. But people are using AI for, you write a blog post, and instead of going to buy some stock footage or get some stock footage for the banner of the blog post, I'll just use AI. I think a lot of people have changed the way they work. I think they will be a little bit disappointed. A lot of people are disappointed by AI hallucinating, but they are changing the way they work a lot. And I see that a lot. And I think for a lot of people, that may qualify for them as an iPhone moment. One of my friends is learning how to invest. He wants to learn how to invest his money, essentially. And he's using AI a lot to analyze companies or to summarize things. So it has changed the way he used to work a lot. It hasn't personally done that to me, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I just don't like a tool that hallucinates 5% of the time. I just don't trust AI from experience. But I think it's doing But I've used AI, you've used AI. When you want to, you're definitely going to generate some shorts from this this podcast. Please send them to me. But you will probably use AI, right, for that. And maybe sometime before, you would have to go, manually and just go through the video and select pieces of the video that were interesting. So I feel like it could be an iPhone moment in the way people do work a lot. However, I think it's not an iPhone moment in terms of the business of software. When we think about the iPhone moment, this is a company that benefited from exceedingly high switching costs from the customers, which means once you're sucked into the iPhone world, you don't want to leave willingly. I am delighted that I can connect my AirPods to my phone and everything works. I bought a MacBook Pro for the first time a couple of months ago. I've had MacBook computers before that belonged to the company I worked for. So I actually never connected it to my, so it's the first time I actually have a MacBook. I can't believe I can just copy text from my iPhone and paste it in my computer. I don't have to just go, copy paste across devices in a smooth way, you can open your notes and your MacBook. The ecosystem, I think people sometimes underestimate how this is actually what the iPhone moment was from a business point of view, was sucking you into an ecosystem that you willingly want to be part of. And you're going to pay a premium even to buy a new phone that will be part of the ecosystem. And this is what gives Apple so much value. I recommend a book called Value Investing by Bruce Greenwald. Greenwald, I think. Yeah. This book is very good at explaining where the value of a company comes from. And there is the assets, like the design of the iPhone. That's the first step. But then there's also the ecosystem, if you want, this competitive advantage of sucking you in. But then there's a third component, which is the growth of the company within that moat, right? Growth by itself in a different line of business does not have value, right? But and this is what Apple has, which is they can bring a new device that they had, like the AirPods, and connect it to the ecosystem, and people will buy it. They will go crazy about that. If they kind of go into a completely different line of business. That's why they don't actually produce their own CPUs. Now they have their own CPUs in their computers, but they've outsourced the production of that. They don't have factories building because that's not their line of business. But when it comes to this ecosystem, that's insane. And what happened to Apple and also other technology companies of that era was this thing of like sucking you in. And that happened to social networks too, due to network effects. Like these companies being able to make a lot of money from having all this audience giving them information so that then you could target ads. And I think what happened during those years was the growth of insanely big technology companies. And what people don't understand, that this didn't have much to do with the technology. It had to do with all of this, the business side of things, the switching costs for Apple, the network effects for Meta or Facebook, which became Meta, and all the social networks. And I think that was, from a business point of view, that was quite a pivotal thing. And everybody got crazy about that then, and all VCs wanting to repeat that, but then failing at it, right? They always want to invest crazy amount of money. It's companies that don't have that edge. But I think that's why I'm saying from a business point of view, AI doesn't benefit at the moment from any of that. People don't have switching costs. They're failing at creating any network effects. I don't know if you've seen that. They tried to create marketplaces where you can kind of share your GPTs and stuff like, but they're failing at producing all of these things that made these technology businesses so successful in the past. So, but then maybe it is an iPhone moment for the people who are using AI every day to do things.
You were on this podcast over 2 years ago now, where we were discussing your book, Smart Until It's Dumb, Why Artificial Intelligence Keeps Making Epic Mistakes and Why the AI Bubble Will Burst. I did ask you this question 2 years ago, so I'll just kind of ask it again to see if your answer, how it's kind of reformulated, which is if hypothetically, if you did have a child that was a senior in high school, graduating high school, going off to college, or maybe not even going off to college, because now, like, ChatGPT 5 is out. Yeah, the DeepSeek moment, Perplexity, there's a bunch of other, Inflection. And as companies integrate this, would you be hesitant for certain majors, hesitant to send your child off to university in the first place, especially having to take on a lot of student debt? Maybe people are going back to brick and mortar stuff. I don't know. What would be kind of your advice for this if someone were to ask you?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I'm curious to know what I said the other time. But what I will say today is becoming a software engineer, for example, if that's what you want. I don't think that's a bad idea nowadays. It's still a good career. I would always try to be at the intersection of business and technology if you do that. Don't be the software developer only that specializes on React Native, because AI will probably, do some of the coding. But helping businesses build successful technology, I think that's still needed. So I wouldn't discourage people from those pursuing those technical careers. because it's not AI will replace software developers. I would discourage people from potentially becoming a translator or things like that. A lot of these things, a lot of the clients only want good enough work. There's definitely very high-end translation, literary translation and stuff, but there's also a lot of people, they translate the website of a restaurant and they just don't care if it's perfect or not, or if it's, and they are kind of, for all this good enough work, I think, if your career, people don't appreciate good quality work, then I would be skeptical of that. But then you mentioned brick and mortar. Like if I had a child today, I would be like, I would tell them, if you want to be successful or rich, you need to do not become a plumber, just a plumber, create a plumbing business. Because I consider this in London. You can't imagine how busy these people are, how solid these businesses seem to be, how expensive it is. Like I hired a plumber recently, and they are charging more per hour or per day than what I used to make when I was a AI consultant with a PhD in AI. It's like they are charging quite a lot more at the moment. So it's the whole world of physical work and boring work, I think, is very appealing. And there's a whole generation that kind of dodged that because it wasn't sexy. Like, who wants to be in the business of in that kind of blue collar thing? It's not sexy. And I think there's a lot to be done. And I've met people who run businesses of soundproofing houses, and it's going very well. So yes, I think the labor market will change. There will be some professions that will be affected, but a lot less than we think. I think a lot of people misunderstand what makes a job difficult in the first place. They say journalists will be replaced because of AI, but have you met a journalist? Have you seen what they do? Screenwriters, they will be replaced. Yeah, there will be some screenwriter, it will potentially be replaced with AI, or some of it will be accelerated thanks to AI, but there's a lot of stuff that goes on in screenwriting that is not really writing your words. Or journalists, I've spoken with journalists, they tell me I'm in the business of relationships, of having a network of people who I know that I can ask for a quote when the time comes. Building that network is all soft skills. Is not, AI can't really do this, So again, a very long answer to your question, but does this match in any way what I may have said before?
Yeah, at first you made a joke, which is basically, I would tell my child to follow their passion.
Really?
That was the, based on what you're, based on what you're saying, though, I can just see the YouTube comments, which would be like, have you actually watched Netflix recently, or Peacock or Paramount? Most of the content is absolutely crap. Clearly, like AI, if that's not AI, if that's actual people writing it, well, then AI probably could do a better job than most of the crap that's out there anyways right now. And the same thing, have you read the New York Times recently? Like, I think AI could do a better job than, these journalists. I think that'd be the response that the average person would probably have. like what world are you living in? Maybe you're not a fan of Netflix or I've been watching Landman recently, which is good. I don't think AI is copying that show, but the reason Landman is so good, Landman with Billy Bob Thornton, John Hamm, Demi Moore. Oh yeah, it's good. Or 1920, some of the Sheridan, was it Taylor Sheridan shows, 1923, 1883.
Yes, I've seen it's a Yellowstone.
Yeah, Yellowstone. Yeah. Yellowstone, I'm not a huge fan of, but the other Taylor Sheridan shows I am. But I'm like, that's like high end, really good production. But most of the other shows are just not that good. Like, I don't think AI would, if they're not using AI, AI certainly wouldn't be any worse.
This is funny because I've been hearing, yes, there's definitely lower end stuff. And I think I said in some interview, or I think in my book, the AI Pocketbook, which came after Smart Table Stuff, I say that soap operas could be an example of, the kind of thing that's very formulaic and it doesn't matter if it's good. They often, they never air again. They're not, because it's just like a thing that's, in the afternoon. And everybody knows it's not very good. And I think that's the kind of low end work that I think AI will do more and more, potentially. But there's the high end work. That's something I would tell, like, there's an excellence gap in work. And I think people, they say this will be done by AI, but if you're a high-end screenwriter, if you're writing Yellowstone, as a writer, I can tell you it's so difficult to write something like that. A lot of things are considered that you didn't even imagine, and then you watch the show and it goes smoothly, but and you enjoy it, and that's not coincidental. There was a lot of work that was put into the show. So I think there's a big gap between high-end work and the good enough kind. And I think the work that is most threatened by AI is the good enough kind. I'm not sure how much people actually like the good enough stuff. I don't know what's going to happen with all that, kind of low-end work anyway. But that's a good point. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of low-end stuff, and that's what AI is threatening probably. And I had the feeling that lately people, when you go to IMDb and you see reviews of shows, and a show is kind of mediocre, people literally say this is like it was written with AI, which kind of tells me that these people associate AI with kind of mediocre work. Right? They don't think, that's why they keep saying it. I've also seen people say these people look like AI. Speaking of actors that got a lot of work done on their faces, and there was this movie with Nicole Kidman and what's the name of that guy? Zac Efron. That was
Zac Efron. Yeah.
Yes, they both look very different. Let's just put it that way. And I saw lots of reviews of people saying it looks like they are AI versions. Like, so this idea that AI is kind of like iffy work or mediocre work. But that kind of strengthens my point, which is that the high-end stuff, people kind of see that AI can't do it very well, and there needs to be like this human touch.
What do you think, though, like in 10 years from now? Because I remember back in the day, people would use the word CGI, right? You'd be talking about, I don't know, Fast and the Furious 5 or Fast and the Furious 7, right? They just kept coming out and people like, oh, look, that movie's so CGI. But then now CGI becomes normal. And so the next iteration of that is instead of having the background and the explosions and someone jumping from an airplane and landing in a convertible in the driver's seat, you're like, oh, that was so CGI. Now the actual actors are CGI, right? Like that's the next but no one actually is like, oh my God, that movie looks so fake. So in 10 years from now, you're going to be like, oh my God, like Nicole Kidman aged in reverse. She looks so good. It's because, yeah, of course, because it's like, or like, oh, Scarlett Johansson, she looks like she's 25 again. Oh my God,
I think there will be a market for AI generated movies even. I think, and I think a lot of people, and one of my friends is trying to do this at the moment, I think a lot of people who want to create content, they will be using AI because the point of the things they're going to be creating is not is actually to tell a story, for example, a documentary, and they're going to use AI because it makes it easier and faster to produce the visual product. Right? There's still all the work in writing things that I think AI will never do fully. You need some editorial angle to really kind of produce a good product, but then they'll definitely use AI, and there will be a market of people who will. There's even these cat videos going viral. This cat that is an animated cat going around Instagram, and it's AI generated. But the point is that the story surrounding the cat is what's fun. Right. And people, they like the story. And I think there's a whole market for that. But I also think there's a whole market that will be insulated a bit from AI. The reason being that it's very difficult to control the output with AI, right? You kind of need to, you write the prompt and then you kind of have to accept what comes out of it, because otherwise you need to start writing longer and longer and longer prompts. And when you don't like one part of the output and you specify in the prompt, you're like, I don't want that, I want this instead. The AI will correct that, but then it will do something different elsewhere that was okay before. And now you have to produce a bigger prompt. So I think for very high-end content, AI will be harder to use, because of all the babysitting that you need to do to get it to do what you want. And that's why I think like if we see AI from a more balanced point of view, I think there will be some disappointment for some people, but other people will really embrace it. So I think that both things are going to happen.
Today's guest has been Dr. Emmanuel Maggiori We discussed his new book today, If You Can Just Print Money, Why Do I Pay Taxes? Modern Monetary Theory Distilled and Debunked in Plain English. So, Emmanuel, you have several other books. Where can people get a hold of your books? You have a big presence on LinkedIn. You also have a blog. Give people that information and then leave us with a final thought.
Okay, so what's the final thought regarding MMT? What would I like to share? I would say that I advise the listener to be very cautious of all these shiny economic theories, of all these seductive economic theories that can be not just MMT, but if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. There's so that's probably my take-home message. And I think MMT is an example of that, something that's very, very seductive. Who doesn't want the free lunch? But there's probably more to it. Right. And I would also say there's a reason why governments have implemented measures to not let the government create money, not let the treasury create money. Right. And the reason is that they are afraid the government's going to go on a spending spree and not control inflation and stuff for political reasons. We should not forget that all these measures that, yes, they are artificial, they could be removed, but they have been introduced for a reason, which is that institutions are designed because people don't trust politicians to do a very good job with the public purse, right? That's why the rules are in there. And then you have all these people telling you, let's remove all the rules. Let me do whatever I want. And me as a politician, trust me to do this properly. And I think that sounds a little bit like releasing a bull in a china shop to me. So let's not forget about what people call the political economy, These politicians are people, and they can be a little bit reckless also with their spending. So let's not let them do whatever they want, which is what MMT is kind of calling for. So yeah, that would be my conclusion if you want regarding MMT and economics. With AI, I would say I think that we need to understand that AI is great at producing things that sound or look great or look believable, right? But that doesn't mean it's the truth or it's accurate. They're not even designed to do that, right? They try to kind of make them as much as they can, to produce accurate or truthful statements and stuff. But this is still very good imitators. And with the huge amount of data on the internet, like you go to Reddit, every single thing has been discussed. Every episode of every show has been discussed by multiple threads. There's a level of or an amount of information that is so big that we could build this AI that uses all that data to imitate humans or what a human would say. And that's very, very, very cool, but it's still an imitation machine, right? It's not necessarily going to produce true statements, accurate statements, reproduce high-end work, like we said. So just remember what AI really is, which is a fantastic imitator built on a huge amount of, Reddit data and other sources of data. But yeah, those are my reflections.
And where do you recommend people go to get a hold of your books, get a hold of your work, your blogs, find you on LinkedIn, that kind of information?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter now, or X also. They can find me. I'm very new to X, but I'm finding it very fun. So you can maybe put the handler in the video so people can find me. And also my book is already available for pre-orders on anywhere. So you can go to Amazon or any other book retailer and you can find my book and pre-order it. It's coming out in April 2026. And it's called If You Can Just Print Money, Why Do I Pay Taxes? And it's written in a very friendly language so that anybody can understand. It's not too technical.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.